It was a major change, period. Now, for me to achieve that as a movement, I had to have something. I had to go political. And it's really ironic for me when I hear those who are really opposed to unions, and even within unions, yap about politics. And this is, you'll notice, is the different types of economy, but you start to see the political formation of the movement. The AFL, the American Federation of Labor, the Knights of Labor, the Congress and Industrial Organizations, an independent, the National Education Association, the eventual merger of the AFL-CIO, an eventual kind of mismerger or whatever with Wind to Change, and I'll talk about in a minute. All of a sudden we saw the advent of federations. Now what are federations? They're simply the political arm of the labor movement at every level of government to lobby government, that is judges, courts, politicians, to the message of the movement. To have laws passed that are supportive of collective bargaining, to protect that one-page document and all that followed it, to have, if you will, judges appointed that are favorably inclined, and to make certain that the system worked. Now, I remind you that you were born here. You were born as a CIO affiliate. You were born of the mass production era. You were born of that federation, not of the AFL. You eventually came together later as the movement saw fit to stop fighting. This is your birthplace. Here is where your industry was born. With the advent of the Industrial Revolution, the advent of the Civil War, all of those things that brought factories about, brought a need for power, a need for utility, a need for sanitation, and in today's world, a need for renewable energy. All of these pieces started to come together. So your industries and its various forms were born here. You were born here as a union to provide protection for workers under that new industry, period. And that's how it happened. If you go over a page, and I'll talk a little bit more about federations, because there are some funny stories. This gives you, and again, I don't do this from the standpoint of timelines, because I hate timelines, and I've laid it out here, but the only reason I've done that is if you go back, this is the better way. This is when it all happened. So I can just see a picture and I can put it on the picture and I say, for me, that's a good, but I want to be a little bit more specific for some reasons. The first of the federation was the Knights of Labor. And the Knights of Labor failed for a very specific reason. The Knights of Labor failed because it offered too many things to too many people. It was a federation that took in the skilled and the unskilled and put them in one house. Now remember that the skilled did not want to be and did not want to organize the unskilled. That's why we ended up with the AFL and the CIO, okay? So what happened is the Knights of Labor brought in both skilled and unskilled. And that was a large measure why they failed. Is because within the federation, it tore itself apart. The fight between the skilled and the unskilled manifested itself right inside of that first attempt, and it blew apart. Now, just to give you a little timeline, I said you became a part of the CIO, but you first became, in '38, the Utility Workers Organizing Committee. What happened is that the organizing committees were set up in the various unions and the various plants under the CIO. Yours started as an organizing committee, and it then eventually, in '46, became a full-fledged affiliate called, obviously, the Utility Workers Union of America, and that was your birth. Your first part of that birth was in '38. The final birth was in '46. You grew exponentially as an organizing committee and eventually became an international union, and that was how it happened. One other comment, you notice a Wind to Change, which was formed in 2006. There was a lot of controversy, and there always has been politically, because there are very different political views within the movement, okay? From left to right to conservative to whatever, to Republicans to Democrats, whatever. And that's all good. It has its bad features, but it has its good features. Its good features are that differences bring debate. Differences bring fights too. I understand that, but I'm a good fighter, so try me. But what happened is a group of unions at that point decided to break away from the House of Labor on the premise they would spend more money organizing. Now, I think the concept of more organizing made sense, because without organizing, you die, because you're shrinking. You're absolutely shrinking. Service Employee International Union, the International Brotherhood of Teamsters, the bartenders, and the carpenters left the House of Labor. And when that happened, again, they organized Wind to Change. Wind to Change never really yet has fulfilled that promise of a lot of organization. And so as a consequence, it's there. There are representations to come back. My suspicion is that at some point, the House of Labor, at the political end, will simply reunite. A couple of things I want to talk about now is the fact that if you go over a page, we have in place now the ability to have lobbying politically. So the movement itself now has gone from being non-political, non-partisan, and what changed all of that was the Big Bang, the Depression. The Depression was so severe in 1929, 30, 31, and 32 that the union movement truly needed a political background and a political spine to survive. They needed laws, they needed support, whatever. Coincidentally, this was at the same time that President Roosevelt came on board. Now, prior to that time, and what happened is in 29, we used to live with something called volunteerism. And I'll describe that in a minute on the next page, but right now, suffice it to say that prior to 1929, the unions were nonpartisan, non-political. And if you looked at the information box underneath this chart, from that point forward, you see three themes. The history of labor legislation tracks the prevailing philosophy of the labor movement at the time. As the philosophy changed, so did the trend in legislation. Non-political, non-partisan, no legislation, Big Bang, now we needed help. And so instantly, or relatively instantly in historical context, the movement had to take on a different persona. Volunteerism was what, in effect, was a word given to things that happened before that. And that is that in the craft area, we voluntarily took care of our own. For those that do remember, and we were talking about it last night, when the air traffic controllers got fired by President Ronald Reagan. And the interesting thing is, everybody said, well, first of all, they all said, well, Ronald Reagan won't, nobody will fire the controllers. Well, guess what? It was predictable. It was predictable because we didn't understand our labor history. Everybody said, why would a former president of an international union called SETSAG fire trade unionists? Because SETSAG is a craft union. Ronald Reagan was a craft unionist. He was not a, quote, mass production unionist. They didn't like it. Who was Ronald Reagan's hero? If you ever read a book about him, it was Calvin Coolidge. Who was Calvin Coolidge? He was a president, but more important, he was the mayor of Boston, and when your police officers went on strike, they fired him. And so it was a natural conclusion that someone with that history would do that. The strike plan, the strike discharge plan was prepared by President John F. Kennedy, was never carried out by Kennedy and or by Nixon. Nixon played around with it when he brought in the military into the post offices in New York, and that was a bust. Ronald Reagan carried out exactly and precisely how he was trained in that other union movement. They were not supportive of public sector workers. They were not supportive of service workers. They were not supportive of factory workers. By that time, he was kind of an old man. Now, I also know there is a lot of theories about, if you will, President Roosevelt, but I'll talk about that in a minute. So when I think about volunteerism, I want to define it a little bit better for you. So let's go over a page and let's take a look at this chart. When this thing called volunteerism, which really Ronald Reagan and the craft unions lived by 100 years before that, what it meant is strength at the bottom. And the strength at the bottom meant that they took care of themselves, that political wasn't really necessary. Well, they transitioned and they didn't know that they had to change. That created the CIO. No pressure from the Federation. The AFL had no right to interfere in local affairs. There was a strong, fervent feeling. But when the Great Depression came, that changed all of the ballpark. But it never really quite changed it for the AFL piece of that. It was the CIO that did it. Volunteerism meant independence among the locals. Yes, we're independent, but we're also a part of a hierarchy, a structure from international to locals to all kinds of pieces that come together to support the process. We were nonpartisan. More political efforts were directed towards getting the state out of labor affairs. Prior to the Great Depression, at any given time, the labor movement, if you look at my box, opposed these laws. They opposed collective bargaining rights by law. They opposed workers' comp. They opposed minimum wage. They opposed unemployment comp. Because up to that point, they were be able to take care of their own. After that, because of such a severe collapse, they weren't. The only labor law that existed before that was the Railroad Labor Act in 1927, and Jose, this answers the last piece of your question. That was a law passed by management. And why? Because the most powerful union at that time in the country were the railroad unions, especially in the South. And they were the towns all across America, these little towns where the railroad workers lived, they dominated it. And the quickest way to break a union's back is when it's planning a strike is to impose a 200-day cooling off period and 55 steps before it gets to Congress to make a decision. You can't hold your membership that long. That's what its purpose was. So they opposed that, but that was a law that did exist before that, but it was not of their origin. It was an origin to break their back.